the United States has never skipped a G20 foreign ministers meeting, until now. Recently, Washington boycotted the G20 gathering in Johannesburg, sending a clear message that its patience with South Africa has run out. But why would the world's most powerful nation refuse to show up at one of the most important international meetings? What did South Africa do that was so unacceptable to the US? And will South Africa back down? Or is this just the beginning of a much larger rebellion against Western dominance? Here, we would like to take a moment and thank you for supporting us and being a valued part of our strong community. And if you are not yet a member, we encourage you to join us and help build an even stronger community together. Let's get started. In a move that shocked diplomats and political analysts worldwide, the United States officially boycotted the G20 foreign ministers meeting in Johannesburg, South Africa. This was not a mere scheduling conflict or an internal government issue. This was a deliberate, calculated act of political retaliation. The announcement came through U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who confirmed that the U.S. would not be sending any high-level representatives to the meeting. The decision sent immediate shockwaves through the international community. The G20 is one of the most important global platforms where major economies come together to discuss trade, financial stability, and geopolitical challenges. The U.S., as the world's largest economy and a founding member of the G20, has never refused to attend such a critical event without an unavoidable reason. This was a snub, a political move with a clear target: South Africa. Beyond just skipping the event, the U.S. also took steps to undermine South Africa's position on the global stage. Reports suggest that Washington quietly pressured its allies to downplay the importance of the Johannesburg meeting and minimize engagement with South African officials. Some American lawmakers even proposed reducing financial cooperation with South Africa, warning that Pretoria's recent political decisions were pushing it toward an anti-Western alliance. The boycott didn't just affect South Africa's diplomatic standing, it also cast doubt on the unity of the G20 itself. With one of its most powerful members refusing to participate, many questioned whether the G20 was beginning to fracture along ideological lines. If the US could refuse to attend simply because it disapproved of another nation's policies, what would stop other countries from doing the same? The message was loud and clear. The United States will not tolerate what it sees as South Africa's defiance. But this boycott was not an isolated incident. It was the latest move in a long string of actions meant to pressure and punish Pretoria for refusing to align with Washington's global strategy. The question now is, what did South Africa do to anger the US so much that it is ready to break G20 unity? For the United States to take such an extreme step as boycotting a G20 meeting, South Africa must have done something serious enough to warrant this level of diplomatic hostility. The truth is that South Africa has been making bold decisions that openly challenge American interests, proving that Pretoria no longer sees itself as a secondary player in the global order. In recent years, it has positioned itself as a key member of the Global South's resistance against Western economic and political dominance, and Washington is furious about it. One of the biggest flashpoints in this growing rift has been South Africa's land reform policies, a deeply controversial issue that has made the US, particularly under Donald Trump, take an increasingly aggressive stance against Pretoria. The South African government has pushed forward plans to redistribute land that was historically seized from Black South Africans under colonial rule and apartheid, aiming to correct centuries of dispossession. However, in the US, this has been twisted into a right-wing media frenzy, portraying land reform as a violent, government-backed theft targeting white farmers. Donald Trump himself amplified this narrative when he tweeted that South Africa was engaged in large-scale killing of white farmers and seizing land. His words were based on misinformation but carried weight in Washington, particularly among his far-right base. Figures like Elon Musk, a South African-born billionaire, further fueled this idea, using his influence to claim that Pretoria was engaged in discriminatory policies that threatened property rights.
Is Donald Trump alone the US president, or does he have a co-president in Elon Musk? Ask South Africa. They are on Musk's hit list and by extension, Trump's. This has led to a diplomatic spat between the US and South Africa, and it threatens to derail global cooperation. It threatens to undermine the G20. Secretary of State Marco Rubio put up this message. He said he would not attend the G20 summit in Johannesburg this month. He parroted Trump's accusations, saying, and I quote, "South Africa is doing very bad things, like expropriating private property," and Rubio fired a parting shot. He said, and I quote, "My job is to advance America's national interests, not waste taxpayer money or coddle anti-Americanism." Now you might wonder, why does Washington care about this? Why does Trump? Well, he might not, but one top advisor certainly does, and that is Elon Musk. Musk was born in apartheid South Africa. His father still lives there, and he is very interested in what happens to land there. Musk will continue to back actions against South Africa, probably until Ramaphosa scraps the law. Until then, expect funding cuts and snubs.
Right-wing media outlets in the U.S. have continuously portrayed land reform as a dangerous socialist policy that could deter foreign investment, making it a key issue for Western business and political elites. While South Africa's land reform is a long overdue effort to correct historical injustices, the U.S. sees it differently. Washington does not just view this policy as an internal South African issue. It sees it as a threat to Western financial interests. Many American companies and investors hold stakes in South African agricultural and mining industries, and the idea that land redistribution could disrupt those interests has alarmed the U.S. economic elite. More importantly, it sets a precedent. If South Africa successfully implements land redistribution without Western approval, other African nations may follow suit, breaking the long-held economic grip the West has had on the continent's resources. But land reform is just one reason for the growing hostility between Washington and Pretoria. The bigger issue is South Africa's geopolitical realignment away from the West and toward new economic partnerships that directly challenge American hegemony. South Africa's growing ties with China and Russia have become one of the most significant geopolitical headaches for the U.S. As a key member of BRICS, Pretoria has embraced economic strategies that threaten the Western-controlled financial system. BRICS has openly pushed for a new global trade network that does not rely on the U.S. dollar, a move that directly challenges Washington's financial influence. South Africa has not only supported these efforts, but has actively worked to strengthen trade and diplomatic relations with Beijing and Moscow, a move that has sent alarm bells ringing in Washington. The U.S. has long relied on the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank as tools to control economic policy in developing nations. These institutions offer financial aid and loans, but often come with strict conditions that force countries into economic policies favorable to the West. South Africa, however, is bypassing these institutions and instead deepening its cooperation with alternative financial mechanisms proposed by BRICS. This shift threatens the U.S.'s ability to dictate financial terms to developing economies, reducing its control over global trade and investment. Adding to the tensions is South Africa's refusal to fall in line with Western foreign policy directives. While many countries have been pressured into isolating Russia following the Ukraine conflict, Pretoria has maintained its neutral stance, refusing to sever diplomatic and economic ties with Moscow. The U.S. has repeatedly attempted to force South Africa into adopting sanctions against Russia, but Pretoria has resisted, choosing instead to maintain an independent foreign policy that does not blindly follow Washington's lead. This independence extends beyond Russia. South Africa has openly supported a multipolar world order where power is not concentrated in the hands of Western nations. It has been vocal in challenging U.S. influence over global governance structures and has called for greater representation of developing nations in global decision-making bodies. Pretoria's stance has gained widespread support among African and Global South nations, making it a leader in the movement to redefine global power dynamics. From Washington's perspective, South Africa is no longer just an ally expressing a few disagreements. It is becoming an active force in reshaping global politics in a way that threatens American dominance. Pretoria's growing confidence in standing up to the U.S. has created a major geopolitical headache for Washington. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. The boycott of the G20 meeting is not just a reaction to one specific issue. It is part of a larger strategy to punish South Africa for refusing to obey Washington's directives. By refusing to attend, the U.S. is attempting to undermine South Africa's diplomatic credibility, isolate it from Western allies, and send a clear message. Any country that dares to defy American interests will face consequences. But South Africa has made its position clear. It is not backing down, and with each step Pretoria takes toward economic and political independence, it challenges the very foundation of U.S. influence in Africa and beyond. But Trump doesn't say it like this. According to him, the tensions between the U.S. and South Africa are not just about land reform and economic alliances. They are deeply tied to the ideological war. Donald Trump likes to call it globalism. Since his first term, Trump has repeatedly attacked international institutions, arguing that they exist to weaken American sovereignty. Under his leadership, the U.S. has withdrawn from key global agreements, undermined the authority of institutions like the United Nations, and adopted a more aggressive stance against countries that refuse to align with American interests. South Africa has become a major target of this approach because it represents everything Trump despises, a country that prioritizes regional independence over Western approval. In Trump's view, South Africa is siding with global forces that challenge U.S. dominance, and that makes it an enemy. His administration's policies reflected this belief, cutting funding to South African development programs, reducing diplomatic engagement, and pushing narratives that frame South Africa as unstable and hostile to Western businesses. This hostility has only escalated with South Africa's continued push for land reform and its growing role within BRICS. Trump and his allies see these policies as evidence that Pretoria is moving too far away from Western influence. By boycotting the G20 meeting, the U.S. is making a calculated move to punish South Africa diplomatically, sending a message that any country that challenges American power will face consequences. But here's the thing, skipping the G20 meeting is not just about South Africa. It is a carefully calculated warning shot to other nations that may be considering a similar path of defiance. The G20 is not just a casual diplomatic gathering. It is a crucial platform where the world's largest economies make high-stakes decisions on trade, financial stability, and global governance. For the U.S. to deliberately boycott such a key event is not just a display of discontent, it is a power move designed to delegitimize South Africa's role on the global stage. It signals to the rest of the world that Washington is willing to use diplomatic isolation as a weapon against nations that refuse to fall in line. The message is loud and clear. Countries that refuse to follow America's lead will be sidelined. The U.S. has historically used economic sanctions, trade restrictions, and diplomatic pressure to control the actions of other nations. This time, it is using the G20 boycott as a new tool of coercion, an attempt to weaken South Africa's credibility and warn other countries that they, too, could face the same treatment if they dare to step out of line. The implication is that South Africa is no longer seen as a trusted partner, but as a problematic force that must be contained. However, this move may backfire spectacularly. The world is no longer the same place it was 2 decades ago when Western nations could easily dictate the rules without pushback. Today, many nations in the global south are beginning to assert their independence, rejecting the outdated notion that they must always follow the economic and political directives of Washington, London, or Brussels. South Africa's defiance is not an isolated case. It is part of a much larger geopolitical shift. Across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, countries are reassessing their alliances and questioning the traditional Western-led world order. They are looking for alternatives, whether through BRICS, regional economic coalitions, or direct bilateral agreements with non-Western powers like China and Russia. Instead of intimidating these nations, the U.S. boycott of the G20 may end up encouraging them to resist American pressure. The moment Washington refuses to sit at the table, it sends a signal that its ability to shape global discussions is weakening. If major nations like South Africa can stand firm despite U.S. disapproval, it emboldens other countries to pursue their interests without fear of retaliation. This is exactly what the U.S. has been trying to prevent. Yet its own diplomatic choices may be accelerating the decline of its global influence. For South Africa, this boycott is unlikely to change its course. Pretoria has made it abundantly clear that it will prioritize its national interests over Washington's demands. South African leadership has been steadily shifting its focus toward new economic and diplomatic partnerships, reducing its dependence on Western financial institutions and aligning with emerging power blocs that do not force ideological loyalty as a condition for cooperation. If anything, the boycott only reinforces South Africa's resolve to continue on its independent path. The real question now is how far the US is willing to go in escalating its retaliation. Will it increase economic pressure through trade restrictions? Will it work behind the scenes to isolate South Africa from global financial systems? Or will it eventually be forced to accept that South Africa is no longer a nation that can be controlled through diplomatic threats? The world is watching closely, and the US may soon find that its old playbook no longer works in a rapidly evolving global order. But this action will have economic impacts. Because the US boycott of the G20 is not just a symbolic gesture, it has real economic consequences. Washington has already started cutting financial aid to South Africa, using concerns over governance and land reform as a justification. The next step could be economic sanctions or trade restrictions. One of the biggest concerns is whether the US will limit South Africa's access to the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, a key trade program that allows African nations to export goods to the US with reduced tariffs. If Washington decides to remove South Africa from AGOA, it could significantly impact the country's economy. However, this could also push South Africa to deepen its trade relationships with China, Russia, and other BRICS nations, accelerating its departure from Western economic reliance. South Africa's leaders seem to be prepared for this possibility. Pretoria has been working on strengthening economic ties with alternative partners, ensuring that if the US decides to go down the path of economic retaliation, it won't be left without options. In the end, let's talk about how this will impact G20. If one of its most powerful members decides to skip meetings as a form of political protest, it sets a dangerous precedent. What happens when other countries start doing the same? If Washington is allowed to weaponize its presence at the G20, what is stopping other nations from boycotting future meetings whenever an agenda item doesn't serve their interests? The moment this becomes an accepted practice, the legitimacy of the G20 itself begins to crumble. The US boycott also raises serious concerns about the credibility of global economic governance. Historically, the G20 has been instrumental in managing financial crises, stabilizing international markets, and fostering diplomatic dialogue between rival nations. But if major players like the US refuse to engage simply because they disagree with a host country's policies, the group risks becoming another ineffective, fractured organization, one that lacks the unity needed to address global challenges. For developing countries, this sends a troubling message. The G20 is only functional when it serves Western interests. The very idea that a single country, no matter how powerful, can undermine a global institution for its political agenda shows that Washington is no longer thinking about collective global stability. It is prioritizing control over cooperation. This could lead to deeper fractures within the G20 itself. Other nations, particularly those in the global south, may question whether the G20 is truly a fair, multilateral institution or just another tool for Western dominance. If Washington continues using diplomatic boycotts as a weapon, it may ultimately push more nations toward alternative global organizations, like BRICS, of which South Africa is a key part. In the long run, the US is not just punishing South Africa, it is eroding trust in the G20 as a whole. If Washington continues putting its political disputes ahead of the group's core mission, the G20 could lose its relevance, paving the way for new global alliances to take its place. The US may believe it is making a strategic move against Pretoria, but it risks weakening its influence in the process. So, the US boycott of the G20 in South Africa is a major moment in global politics. It signals Washington's frustration with a country that refuses to be controlled. South Africa's leadership has made it clear that it is willing to challenge Western influence, and the US is responding with economic and diplomatic pressure. But this pressure may not be enough to stop the shift that is already happening. The world is changing, and South Africa is at the center of that change. The question is no longer whether the US will punish South Africa. It's whether South Africa and the rest of the global South are ready to move beyond Western dominance for good. Do you think the US is making a mistake? Should it step back? Let us know in the comment section. Do you think South Africa is on the right track? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.